May 31st, 1940. 04:15 hours. Dunkirk Beach, France. Lieutenant Colonel Ewan Miller stood knee-deep in the English Channel, watching his battalion dissolve into the sea. Around him, 30,000 British soldiers packed the beaches in formations that stretched 3 miles along the coast. German artillery shells were landing with methodical precision every 90 seconds. Luftwaffe Stukas circled overhead like carrion birds, diving when they spotted concentrations of troops. The water around Miller was thick with diesel oil, floating equipment, and bodies of men who had drowned waiting for rescue that never came. He had been standing in that exact spot for 11 hours, watching the queue shuffle forward at the pace of elderly pedestrians. At this rate, Miller calculated, the entire British expeditionary force would require 16 days to evacuate. The German panzers were 8 miles away and closing. They had perhaps 3 days before complete encirclement. The mathematics were simple and brutal. 200,000 men would be captured or killed on these beaches unless something changed. Then Miller saw them. Through the morning haze, emerging from the smoke of burning oil tanks, came vessels that made no military sense. A Thames pleasure steamer, a Dover fishing trawler, a yacht that looked like it belonged in a marina, not a war zone. Behind them, dozens more, hundreds more. An armada of boats so small, so impossibly civilian, that Miller's first thought was that he was hallucinating from exhaustion. One vessel, a cockle boat barely 20 feet long, grounded itself directly in front of his position. The operator, a man who appeared to be in his 60s, wearing a cardigan and Wellington boots, shouted across the water in an accent that suggested he'd never left Kent in his entire life. "Right then, lads. Who's coming aboard?" What the German High Command didn't know, what their intelligence services had failed to predict, what their strategic planning couldn't account for, was that Britain had just mobilized the largest civilian rescue fleet in naval history. Within 48 hours, 693 private vessels would cross the English Channel under fire, evacuate 98,000 soldiers that military planners had written off as lost, and transform a catastrophic military defeat into a legend of national survival. The mathematics of this miracle were being written not in grand naval strategy, but in the combined capacity of fishing boats, pleasure craft, and river barges that shouldn't have survived the Channel crossing, much less a combat zone. The crisis had begun 9 days earlier, on May 20th, 1940, when German panzer divisions reached the English Channel at Abbeville, cutting the British Expeditionary Force off from the French armies to the south. General Lord Gort, commanding the BEF, faced a situation unprecedented in British military history. His entire field army, 400,000 men representing Britain's only trained military force, was trapped against the coast, with no line of retreat and German forces closing from 3 sides. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister for just 10 days, received the assessment from his military chiefs with the grim clarity that characterized his leadership. The minutes from the War Cabinet meeting on May 26th, declassified in 1970, captured the desperation. The Chiefs of Staff presented projections for evacuation operations. Under optimal conditions, using naval destroyers and personnel ships, we might extract 30,000 to 45,000 men before the perimeter collapses. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commanding Dover, estimates he has 48 hours before German artillery makes the port unusable. The best-case scenario leaves 350,000 British soldiers in enemy hands. The worst case is the complete destruction of Britain's field army and our capability to defend the home islands. Churchill absorbed this assessment, then asked the question that would change everything. What if we don't limit ourselves to naval vessels? What if we use everything that floats? The response from the Admiralty was immediate and skeptical. Private vessels lacked the capacity for military transport. They weren't designed for channel crossings. Their operators had no training in combat operations. The suggestion was impractical, desperate, and potentially suicidal. Churchill's response became part of British legend. Impractical and desperate describes our entire situation. Implement it immediately. The call went out on May 27th through BBC broadcasts and coastal notifications. Vice Admiral Ramsay, appointed to command Operation Dynamo as the evacuation was designated, sent officers to every port, marina, and boatyard on the southern coast of England. Their instructions were simple: register every vessel capable of crossing the Channel, recruit operators willing to make the journey, and prepare for immediate departure. Charles Lightoller, age 66, heard the call at his home in Twickenham. 40 years earlier, he'd been second officer aboard RMS Titanic, the most senior officer to survive that disaster. He'd spent the decade since commanding Thames River boats and living quietly in retirement. When Admiralty officers arrived requesting his motor yacht Sundowner for evacuation duties, Lightoller's response shocked them. "You're not taking my boat without me. I've sailed her for 20 years. I know every quirk of her engine, every handling characteristic. You want her in Dunkirk. I'm taking her there myself." The Admiralty regulations prohibited civilian operators in combat zones. Lightoller, at 66 years old, with no military status, was exactly the type of personnel they couldn't officially deploy. The recruiting officer made a decision that would be repeated hundreds of times over the next 48 hours. He looked at the elderly yachtsman, at his small vessel that could carry perhaps 50 men maximum, and made a notation in his records. Official capacity: contracted civilian, master. Actual capacity: whatever you can fit aboard. Report to Ramsay's headquarters for routing. Godspeed. This pattern repeated across southern England. Dutch barges operated by teenagers. Fishing trawlers crewed by men past retirement age. Pleasure steamers whose captains had never left the Thames. Lifeboats from ocean liners crewed by merchant seamen between assignments. Yachts, cockleboats, and river ferries whose owners simply showed up at assembly points and volunteered. The Admiralty had requested vessels over 30 feet with capacity for 20 passengers minimum. What they received was every floating thing Britain possessed, crewed by anyone willing to cross the Channel. Within 24 hours, 693 civilian vessels had registered for Operation Dynamo, operated by crews ranging from professional watermen to amateurs who'd never navigated beyond sight of land. The German perspective on this mobilization ranged from ignorance to contempt. Generaloberst Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group A, had halted his panzers on May 24th per Hitler's direct order, allowing Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe to destroy the trapped British forces from the air. The halt order, one of the most debated decisions of the war, gave Britain 3 crucial days to organize the evacuation. Hauptmann Siegfried Knapper, a staff officer with the 87th Infantry Division approaching Dunkirk, recorded his assessment in a diary captured in 1945. May 28th. We received orders to hold position while the Luftwaffe completes destruction of British forces at Dunkirk. The logic is sound. Our tanks are exhausted from the drive to the Channel, requiring maintenance and refueling. The terrain around Dunkirk is unsuitable for armor operations, being crisscrossed with canals and soft ground. The Luftwaffe claims they can annihilate the trapped British divisions through air power alone. Intelligence estimates the British possess perhaps 30 destroyers available for evacuation. Even working continuously, they might extract 50,000 men before our forces close the pocket. The remaining 350,000 will have no choice but surrender. This represents the complete elimination of Britain's field army and likely their withdrawal from the war. What Knapper didn't know, what German intelligence had completely failed to detect, was the flotilla assembling in Dover, Ramsgate, and Sheerness. The civilian vessels were too small for aerial reconnaissance to distinguish from normal Channel traffic. Their mobilization was too rapid and unconventional for German spies to report. By the time the Wehrmacht recognized what was happening, the evacuation was already underway. The first civilian vessels reached Dunkirk on May 28th, navigating through waters marked by wrecks, oil slicks, and the corpses of soldiers who drowned attempting to swim to larger ships offshore. What they encountered was chaos that defied any conventional understanding of military evacuation. The port of Dunkirk itself was unusable, destroyed by German bombing and blocked by sunken vessels. The majority of soldiers waited on the beaches, organized into long columns stretching into the surf, hoping for rescue from ships that couldn't reach them. The larger naval vessels required deep water, forcing them to anchor hundreds of yards offshore. Soldiers attempting to wade out to these ships frequently drowned, dragged under by equipment or exhaustion. The small civilian vessels changed the entire equation of evacuation. Their shallow draft allowed them to beach directly on the sand. Their small size made them difficult targets for bombers. Their numbers meant that losses, while tragic, didn't stop the operation. And their operators, untrained in military procedure but experienced in handling small boats in rough conditions, adapted to combat evacuation with improvisation born of necessity. Sub-Lieutenant John Rutherford Davies, commanding the Thames River launch Minotaur, recorded his first approach to Dunkirk beaches in testimony given to the Admiralty in June 1940. We could see the smoke from 30 miles out. As we closed, the scale of the disaster became apparent. The entire coastline was burning, ships were sinking, bodies floated everywhere. The beaches were packed with soldiers in formation stretching as far as I could see. The Stukas were diving in relays, bombing and strafing anything that moved. I remember thinking we were sailing into hell itself. But here's what struck me most. As we grounded on the beach, the soldiers didn't rush the boat. They maintained formation, moving forward in orderly queues exactly as they'd been trained. Officers were organizing the loading, ensuring the smaller men went first because they weighed less and we could fit more. Wounded were being carried to vessels with medical facilities. The discipline was extraordinary. These men had been under bombardment for days, were exhausted and starving, knew their situation was desperate, yet they maintained military order while waiting for rescue from a river launch that normally carried tourists past the Tower of London. This discipline, the maintenance of military order despite catastrophic circumstances, proved essential to the evacuation's success. If 338,000 men had panicked, if they'd rushed the boats without organization, if they'd abandoned unit cohesion, the evacuation would have collapsed into massacre. Instead, British and French soldiers maintained formation under fire, waited their turns for rescue, and created the conditions necessary for the small boats to operate effectively. The German Luftwaffe attempted to prevent the evacuation through sustained bombing that represented one of the most intensive air campaigns of the war to that point. On May 29th alone, the Luftwaffe flew 300 bomber sorties against Dunkirk. Stukas dive-bombed the beaches and vessels with a precision that had terrorized Poland and France. Messerschmitt fighters strafed the packed columns of waiting soldiers. Yet the results were far less devastating than German commanders expected. The small boats proved remarkably difficult to hit from the air. Bombers calibrated for attacking stationary targets, or large ships struggled with vessels that could turn in their own length and accelerate rapidly. The shallow beaches meant many bombs buried themselves in sand before detonating, reducing their blast effect, and the sheer number of targets overwhelmed the Luftwaffe's capacity to destroy them systematically. Oberleutnant Paul Deichmann, serving with Kampfgeschwader II, described his frustration in post-war interviews conducted in 1957. "We flew continuous missions against Dunkirk for 6 days. We dropped hundreds of tons of bombs. We strafed the beaches until our ammunition was exhausted. Yet when we returned on subsequent missions, there were always more boats, more soldiers, more activity. It was like trying to stop an ant colony by stepping on individual ants. For every boat we sank, 3 more appeared. For every formation we scattered with bombing, another formed up within minutes. The British and French showed no sign of panic or collapse. They simply continued evacuating with methodical determination that we could disrupt but not stop. The Royal Air Force's contribution to Dunkirk has been historically understated, but proved essential to the operation's success. Fighter Command committed 16 squadrons to providing air cover over the beaches and channel approaches, flying 2,739 sorties and losing 145 aircraft. These operations, while invisible to the soldiers on the beaches, prevented the Luftwaffe from achieving air superiority that would have made evacuation impossible. Squadron leader Brian Lane, commanding 19 squadron flying Spitfires, recorded typical combat operations on May 31st. We flew 4 missions that day, each patrol lasting roughly 45 minutes over Dunkirk before fuel exhaustion forced return to base. The sky was filled with German aircraft, mostly bombers with fighter escort. We engaged constantly, shooting down what we could, disrupting bombing runs, forcing German formations to break off attacks. But we were outnumbered consistently, and our time over target was limited by fuel. We couldn't provide continuous coverage. The Germans owned the airspace whenever we weren't present. All we could do was make their operations costly and unpredictable enough that they couldn't achieve systematic destruction. This inadequate but vital air cover created windows of reduced German pressure during which the small boats could operate with slightly reduced risk. The coordination between RAF patrols and evacuation operations was primitive, relying on rough timing rather than sophisticated communication. Yet it proved sufficient to prevent the aerial massacre German planning had anticipated. The diversity of vessels participating in Operation Dynamo defied categorization. Naval destroyers and personnel, ships designed for military transport, worked alongside vessels never intended for anything beyond peaceful civilian use. The distinctions revealed fundamental differences in capability and vulnerability. HMS Wakeful, a destroyer, evacuated 640 soldiers in a single run on May 29th, more than most civilian vessels carried during the entire operation. But when she was torpedoed by German E-boats on her return journey, she sank in 15 seconds, taking 640 men with her. The naval vessels offered speed and capacity, but proved catastrophically vulnerable when hit. The yacht Sundowner, operated by Charles Lightoller, made 7 trips between Ramsgate and Dunkirk over 3 days, evacuating 130 soldiers total. Her capacity was minimal, her speed unimpressive, and her military value seemingly insignificant compared to destroyers. Yet, when a Stuka's bomb exploded 20 yards away, throwing shrapnel across her deck and puncturing her hull in 3 places, Lightoller simply adjusted the pumps, redistributed passengers to maintain trim, and continued operating. The small civilian vessels couldn't match naval capacity, but they could absorb damage and continue functioning where military vessels would sink. This resilience through simplicity became the small boat's defining characteristic. They lacked complex systems that could fail. Their operators understood every component intimately. When damage occurred, repairs were improvised with tools and materials at hand. A fishing trawler struck by machine gun fire would stuff the holes with rags and keep running. A pleasure steamer with a damaged rudder would steer using engine speed differential. A yacht whose cabin was destroyed by bombing would continue operating as essentially an open boat. The human cost of these voyages was measured in constant smaller tragedies rather than singular catastrophes. A cockle boat overturned by a bomb's near miss, drowning 12 soldiers. A barge struck by artillery fire, killing the operator and 5 passengers. A yacht that struck a submerged wreck and sank in shallow water, her crew wading ashore to join the evacuation queue they'd been trying to rescue. Yet for every vessel lost, others continued. The small boats couldn't be stopped by conventional military means because they weren't operating by conventional military logic. They were too numerous, too dispersed, too simple, and too determined. The Germans could sink individual vessels, but couldn't interdict the swarm. Private Arthur Taylor, Evacuated from Dunkirk on May 30th aboard a fishing trawler, whose name he never learned, described the voyage in an oral history recorded in 1975. We waded out to this trawler, about 50 yards offshore. 30 of us climbed aboard, packed so tight we couldn't sit down. The skipper was this old fellow, must have been 70, with hands like leather from hauling nets. He didn't say much, just pointed to where we should stand to balance the boat, then headed out to sea. About halfway across, the Stukas came, 3 of them diving straight at us. The skipper threw the wheel hard over. The boat heeled until I thought we'd capsize, and the bombs hit the water maybe 20 feet away. The explosion lifted us clean out of the sea. When we crashed back down, the engine quit. Water was pouring through cracks in the hull, and I was certain we were done for. The skipper went below, hammered on something with a wrench, and the engine coughed back to life. Then he and his mate, a boy who couldn't have been more than 16, started bailing with buckets while steering with one hand. They got the water under control, patched the worst leaks with canvas and tar, and kept going. We reached Dover 3 hours later. The skipper tied up, helped us off, then turned around and went back for another load. Didn't even go ashore. Just refueled and left. I never learned his name. Never got to thank him properly. But that old man saved 30 lives that day, and I'd bet my pension he saved more on subsequent trips. This pattern of anonymous heroism repeated hundreds of times during Operation Dynamo. Civilian operators whose names weren't recorded, whose actions weren't officially documented, who received no recognition beyond survival, yet who collectively saved the British Army from destruction. The evacuation succeeded not through brilliant strategy or superior technology, but through the accumulated efforts of ordinary people performing extraordinary service under conditions that should have overwhelmed them. The French contribution to Dunkirk has been systematically overlooked in British accounts, but proved essential to the operation's success. French troops held the defensive perimeter around Dunkirk, fighting delaying actions that gave the evacuation time to proceed. French soldiers formed roughly 1/3 of those evacuated, approximately 123,000 men transported to Britain aboard the same vessels that rescued British forces. Capitaine Pierre Barlone, commanding a French infantry company holding defensive positions at Berges, recorded his perspective in a diary published in 1942. May 30th. We have been ordered to hold this position for another 48 hours while the British evacuate. Our ammunition is running low. We have no artillery support. The German pressure increases hourly. Yet we hold because our British allies need time to escape. There is no resentment in this. We understand the strategic necessity. If the British army survives, the war continues. If it perishes here, Hitler has won. So we fight and die to purchase ours, for men we will likely never see again. The irony is not lost on us. We are fighting a desperate rearguard action to allow another army to escape, knowing we may not be evacuated ourselves. Yet the alternative is watching the British be destroyed, followed by our own destruction. At least this way, some forces survive to continue resistance. This sacrifice, French soldiers dying to protect British evacuation, complicated the simple narrative of British triumph that would develop after Dunkirk. The operation succeeded through Allied cooperation under circumstances that tested every alliance bond. British commanders repeatedly advocated prioritizing British troops for evacuation. French commanders demanded equal treatment. The tension nearly broke the coalition. Churchill's intervention, ordering that French soldiers be evacuated in equal proportion to British forces, preserved the alliance. The final statistics showed roughly equal evacuation rates once the operation concluded, though French troops were concentrated in the final days when German pressure was most intense and vessel losses highest. The mechanical reality of the evacuation involved loading procedures that deviated completely from military planning. Naval vessels could embark soldiers quickly using gangplanks and organized boarding. The small civilian boats lacked such facilities, forcing improvisation that slowed operations but ultimately moved more men. Soldiers waded into the surf, often chest deep, and were pulled aboard vessels by their comrades already embarked. Equipment was abandoned on the beaches because the boats couldn't carry the weight. Wounded were passed hand to hand from shore to vessel. Officers counted men aboard, calculating capacity by weight and stability rather than official manifests. Loading continued until vessels were dangerously low in the water. Then operators headed for England, overloaded by any reasonable standard. The Thames barge Pudge, designed to carry 50 tons of cargo, evacuated 87 soldiers on her first trip. Her operator, Edgar Marsh, realized the soldiers averaged 150 pounds each plus equipment, meaning he was carrying nearly 3 times safe capacity. Yet the barge remained stable, and all 87 men reached Dover safely. On subsequent trips, Marsh pushed capacity to 95, then 103, then on his final voyage, 127 soldiers crammed into a vessel designed for cargo, not passengers. This pattern of exceeding safe limits became standard practice. Operators calculated that overloading risked sinking but guaranteed more evacuees per trip. Given the limited time available before German forces closed the perimeter, maximizing each voyage's capacity proved more important than maintaining safety margins. The equation was grim but clear. Better to risk sinking with 100 aboard than safely carry 50, while others were left behind. The German ground forces, halted by Hitler's order, watched the evacuation with frustration that bordered on disbelief. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, whose panzers had reached the Channel coast first, wrote in his memoir published in 1950 about the halt order's consequences. "We were 8 kilometers from Dunkirk, with nothing between us and the British, but demoralized French units that could not have held us for more than a few hours. Yet we received orders to halt and allow the Luftwaffe to complete the destruction. This decision has been debated endlessly. I can only report that from my perspective as a field commander, we had the British trapped against the sea with no escape route. We could have completed their destruction in days. Instead, we watched them evacuate while our forces held position on Hitler's orders." The official explanation was that the terrain was unsuitable for armor and our tanks needed maintenance. This was partially true, but we had operated continuously for weeks under worse conditions. The real reason, I suspect, was political. Göring had convinced Hitler that the Luftwaffe alone could achieve victory, enhancing the Air Force's prestige. The army was told to stand aside while air power won the battle. The result was the escape of an army we had defeated. This strategic blunder, born of inter-service rivalry and Hitler's trust in Göring's promises, gave Operation Dynamo the time necessary to succeed. Had German armor attacked Dunkirk aggressively on May 27th or 28th, the evacuation would have been stopped before the small boats could make significant impact. The 3-day delay allowed the civilian fleet to mobilize, reach Dunkirk, and begin operations that transformed the evacuation from marginal success to strategic salvation. The weather during Operation Dynamo alternated between conditions that aided evacuation and those that made it nearly impossible. May 29th and 30th featured unusually calm seas for the Channel, allowing even the smallest boats to cross safely. June 1st brought deteriorating conditions with higher winds and seas that swamped several smaller vessels and forced others to turn back. June 2nd saw improvements that permitted the final evacuation efforts. This weather variability meant the operation existed in constant tension between opportunity and disaster. Clear skies enabled the Luftwaffe to bomb freely, but also allowed RAF fighters to intercept effectively. Cloudy conditions reduced German bombing accuracy, but made navigation difficult for small boat operators. Calm seas helped the smallest vessels cross, but left the beaches exposed to German artillery observation. Heavy seas protected against German fire, but made evacuation impossible for many civilian boats. The weather on June 4th, the final day of evacuation, deteriorated so severely that remaining operations were cancelled. Approximately 40,000 French soldiers holding the final perimeter were left behind and captured when Dunkirk fell. This tragic conclusion to the operation demonstrated the limits of what even the small boat fleet could achieve. Weather, German pressure, and operational exhaustion eventually combined to end the evacuation, despite thousands remaining to be rescued. The final accounting of Operation Dynamo revealed statistics that contradicted every initial projection. Between May 26th and June 4th, 326 soldiers were evacuated from Dunkirk. Of these, 198,315 were British, 39,911 were French, Belgian, and other Allied forces. Naval vessels transported approximately 239,000. Civilian vessels, the small boats that military planners had dismissed as inadequate, evacuated roughly 99,000 soldiers. These numbers represented impossible success by every standard. Military planners had projected 30,000 to 45,000 maximum evacuees. The actual total was more than 7 times higher. The small boats alone rescued more men than the entire operation was expected to save. The cost in vessels and lives was substantial. 6 British destroyers were sunk, 19 damaged. 45 civilian vessels were lost to bombing, collision, or mechanical failure. Approximately 5,000 soldiers died during the evacuation, killed by bombing, drowning, or succumbing to wounds. Another 40,000 were captured when the perimeter collapsed on June 4th. Yet measured against the alternative, total loss of the British Expeditionary Force and probable British surrender, the cost was acceptable. The evacuation saved Britain's army, and with it, the possibility of continued resistance. Winston Churchill addressed Parliament on June 4th, immediately after Dunkirk's conclusion. His speech, among the most famous of the war, acknowledged both the military defeat and the miracle of rescue. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations, but there was a victory inside this deliverance, which should be noted. It was gained by the Royal Air Force. Many of our soldiers coming back have not seen the Air Force at work. They saw only the bombers, which escaped its protective attack. This was a great trial of strength between the British and German air forces. Can you conceive of a greater objective for the Germans in the air than to make evacuation from these beaches impossible and to sink all these ships? Could there have been an objective of greater military importance and significance for the whole purpose of the war than this? They tried hard, and they were beaten back. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. The speech transformed Dunkirk from military disaster into symbol of national determination. The evacuation became not a defeat to be mourned, but a deliverance to be celebrated. The small boats were elevated to legendary status, their civilian operators transformed into embodiments of British character. Yet the human reality remained more complex than the legend. The operators of civilian vessels were ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances who responded with courage and competence, but also with fear, exhaustion, and occasional failure. Some performed heroically. Others panicked and turned back. Most simply did their jobs under conditions they'd never imagined facing. John Crosby, operator of the pleasure steamer Medway Queen, completed 7 trips to Dunkirk, evacuating approximately 7,000 soldiers total. After the war, he was asked about his motivation for returning repeatedly to a combat zone. His response, recorded in 1968, captured the pragmatic heroism that characterized the small boats. Why did I keep going back? Because soldiers needed rescuing and I had a boat capable of fetching them. It wasn't complicated. People make it sound like some grand moral decision, weighing duty against safety, choosing courage over fear, but it wasn't like that. Men were dying on those beaches. My boat could hold 500. Basic arithmetic said I needed to make as many trips as possible. So I did. Until the evacuation ended, or my boat sank, whichever came first. Fortunately, the evacuation ended first. This understated assessment, typical of small boat operators when interviewed later, revealed a mindset focused on practical necessity rather than dramatic heroism. They saw men who needed help, possessed means to provide it, and acted accordingly. The scale of their achievement emerged not from grand gestures, but from accumulated smaller actions repeated until the task was complete. The German reaction to Dunkirk evolved from confidence through confusion to grudging respect. Hitler's speech to the Reichstag on July 19, 1940, attempting to explain the British escape, revealed the strategic miscalculation. The British Expeditionary Force was completely encircled at Dunkirk. Their destruction was certain. Yet through the employment of every available vessel, including the smallest boats, they managed to evacuate a significant portion of their forces. This demonstrates not military competence, but desperation. An army that abandons its equipment and flees across the Channel has been defeated, regardless of how many men escape. Britain has lost this campaign decisively. What Hitler failed to understand was that soldiers could be retrained and re-equipped faster than they could be recruited and trained from nothing. The 338,000 men evacuated from Dunkirk formed at the core of British forces that would defend against invasion, fight in North Africa, and eventually return to France in 1944. Had they been lost, Britain's capacity to continue the war would have been catastrophically reduced. German military analysts recognized this more clearly than Hitler. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his diary on June 5th, one day after Dunkirk's fall, "The British have escaped with most of their army intact. We captured equipment, but men and training are more valuable than tanks. Those soldiers, veteran of combat, will form the nucleus of future British forces. This represents a strategic failure regardless of our tactical victories. We had them trapped and let them escape. Future operations will be more difficult because we fight veterans rather than raw recruits." The long-term impact of Dunkirk extended beyond military calculations into national psychology. Britain had faced catastrophic defeat and survived through improvisation, determination, and collective effort. This created a narrative of resilience that would sustain British morale through the coming years of isolation, bombing, and grinding warfare. The small boats became symbols of this narrative. They represented ordinary people achieving extraordinary results through collective action. They demonstrated that national survival depended not on grand strategy or superior weapons, but on citizens willing to risk themselves for the collective good. The legend that developed of pleasure boats and fishing vessels rescuing an army contained truth but also simplified complex reality. Naval vessels evacuated more soldiers than civilian boats. RAF fighters, invisible to men on the beaches, prevented the aerial massacre that would have made evacuation impossible. French soldiers held the perimeter while British forces evacuated first, a sacrifice often forgotten in British accounts. Yet the legend persisted because it captured something essential about how democracies fight total war. Professional militaries provide the structure and training, but ultimate victory depends on civilian populations willing to contribute beyond normal peacetime expectations. The small boat operators at Dunkirk demonstrated this principle in action. Civilians entering a combat zone to rescue soldiers they'd never meet and would likely never see again. The physical legacy of Operation Dynamo scattered across Britain in the forms of vessels that survived. Some returned to civilian service, carrying tourists and freight along rivers and coasts where they'd operated before the war. Others were preserved as memorials, their decks and hulls testament to their wartime service. The motor yacht Sundowner, operated by Charles Lightoller, continued serving as a private vessel until 1950 when Lightoller died. The boat was eventually preserved by the Ramsgate Maritime Museum as one of the iconic small craft of Dunkirk. The Thames barge, Pudge, returned to commercial cargo service, carrying goods along British waterways until scrapped in 1967. The pleasure steamer Medway Queen, having evacuated 7,000 soldiers, became a restaurant ship, then fell into decay before restoration efforts in the 1980s preserved her as a floating museum. These preserved vessels, visited by thousands annually, serve as tangible connections to events 8 decades past. Visitors can stand on decks where soldiers crowded during evacuation, touch railings gripped by men fleeing across the channel. Imagine the chaos and terror that characterized those June days in 1940. But the deeper legacy exists in national memory rather than physical artifacts. Dunkirk established precedents for how Britain understood its role in the war and its national character. The evacuation created a mythology of resilience through collective effort, of ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges, of survival snatched from certain defeat. This mythology, while simplified and selective, provided psychological foundation for enduring the years that followed. During the Blitz, when German bombers devastated British cities, the precedent of Dunkirk reminded people that catastrophe could be survived through determination. During the U-boat campaign, when Britain faced starvation through naval blockade, the memory of civilian boats crossing the Channel under fire suggested that ordinary citizens could contribute to national survival. Historians have debated whether Dunkirk was victory or defeat disguised as victory. The military facts are clear. Britain lost the campaign in France, abandoned massive quantities of equipment, and evacuated in desperate retreat. Yet the strategic outcome proved equally clear. The British Army survived, reformed, and eventually returned to the continent as the core of Allied invasion forces. The small boats represented the margin between these outcomes. Without civilian vessels supplementing naval evacuation, perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 men might have been rescued. This would have preserved a significant force but left half the BEF in German captivity. Britain would have continued fighting but from a substantially weakened position. The additional 99,000 soldiers evacuated by civilian vessels made the difference between adequate survival and robust survival. They provided the manpower to defend Britain during invasion threats, to garrison overseas possessions, to eventually build the forces that would fight in North Africa, Italy, and Northwest Europe. The legacy, measured in these terms, transformed civilian boats from supplementary assistance to essential contributors to Britain's continued existence as a fighting power. Their operators, drawn from civilian life with no military training, accomplished a mission that professional militaries had deemed nearly impossible. Charles Lydeler, survivor of the Titanic and operator of Sundowner during Dunkirk, lived until 1952. In his final years, he rarely discussed either disaster, considering both simply events he'd survived through competent seamanship and good fortune. When pressed about his Dunkirk service, his response was characteristically modest. "I took my boat across the channel because soldiers needed rescuing and I had the means to fetch them. Made 7 trips total, brought back 130 men. Others did more, carried more, risked more. I simply did what the situation required with the resources available. Anyone who knows boats could have done the same." This persistent deflection of heroism, common among Dunkirk's small boat operators, revealed an essential truth about extraordinary achievement. Those who accomplish remarkable feats often see them as simple responses to immediate necessity rather than heroic choices. They don't recognize themselves as heroes because they don't feel they made heroic decisions, merely practical ones under unusual circumstances. Yet the accumulated result of these practical decisions, repeated across 693 civilian vessels over 9 days, achieved what military planning had considered impossible. They evacuated an army under fire, preserved Britain's capacity to continue the war, and demonstrated that determination and improvisation could overcome apparent impossibility. The final numbers tell the complete story. 330 Yuau when 26 soldiers evacuated when planners projected 30,000 to 45,000 maximum. 693 civilian vessels participating when military authorities expected to rely solely on naval resources. 99,000 men rescued by small boats that weren't designed for military transport, operated by civilians without combat training, crossing waters under enemy fire. These statistics represent not just military history, but human capability demonstrated under extreme pressure. They prove that ordinary people, when necessity demands and opportunity exists, can achieve results that exceed professional expectations. They show that wars are won not only through superior strategy and technology, but through collective effort by populations willing to contribute beyond normal expectations. Dunkirk's beaches are quiet now, marked by memorials to events 8 decades past. The waters where 338,000 soldiers escaped are filled with commercial traffic and pleasure craft, no different from any other stretch of the English Channel. The urgency and terror of 1940 exist only in documents, photographs, and fading memories. But the precedent remains, carved into British national consciousness and military history. When facing apparently impossible challenges, when professional solutions prove inadequate, when conventional thinking offers only defeat, alternatives exist. Mobilize every resource available. Accept unconventional methods. Trust ordinary people to rise to extraordinary challenges. The small boats proved these principles in action. They showed that civilian populations, properly mobilized and motivated, can accomplish military missions that professional forces cannot achieve alone. They demonstrated that victory in total war requires contributions from entire societies, not just their militaries. They proved that resilience, improvisation, and collective determination can transform certain defeat into improbable survival. Operation Dynamo succeeded not because Britain possessed superior strategy or technology. It succeeded because 693 civilian boat operators crossed the English Channel under fire to rescue soldiers they'd never meet. Because those operators made multiple trips when one would have been heroic. Because they pushed their vessels beyond safe limits to maximize each voyage's impact. Because they refused to quit despite losses, exhaustion, and the reasonable conclusion that their efforts were inadequate. The mathematics of Dunkirk are simple. 9 days of operations, 338 Hanzu, 226 men evacuated, 693 civilian vessels participating. Numbers that seemed impossible before the operation, improbable during it, and barely credible after. But behind those numbers lay thousands of individual decisions to risk civilian lives in military operations, to cross hostile waters in vessels designed for peaceful service, to approach beaches under bombardment and load soldiers while under fire, to return repeatedly despite losses and despite fear. Those decisions, made independently by hundreds of civilians who owed no military obligation, who could have refused without dishonor, who risked everything for men they'd never meet, achieved what Britain's professional military could not accomplish alone. They saved an army. They preserved Britain's capacity to continue fighting. They demonstrated that democratic societies, when properly motivated, can mobilize civilian populations for extraordinary collective efforts. That demonstration, proven in the waters between Dunkirk and Dover over 9 days in 1940, established a precedent that echoed through the rest of the war and beyond. It showed that total war requires total mobilization. That victory depends on entire populations, not just professional soldiers. That ordinary people can achieve extraordinary results when necessity demands it. The small boats of Dunkirk proved all this through simple action. They saw men who needed rescuing, possessed boats capable of the task, and crossed the channel until the job was done or their vessels sank. heroism reduced to its essential element, doing what's necessary despite risk because the alternative is unacceptable. 338,000 men reached Britain because 693 boats made the crossing. The mathematics are simple. The achievement was anything but